Hey folks, this is Kelani. With Battle for Azeroth quickly approaching, we're running out of time to lock in our choices of main characters, at least for the first few days. It doesn't really matter what we do after that, right? All the alts we're going to level, but we need to make sure that very first character we level is one we enjoy and one that's going to do well in all sorts of content. Raids are still important, but Mythic plus dungeons might be even more important in BFA than they were in Legion, especially with the high item level Azerite armor available through the weekly cache. We already looked through the tank specs and we went through the ranged DPS specs as well, so the next chaps on the chopping block are the melee. You know who you are, the warriors smashing your face into anything you can reach, the rogues hanging out in Darkshore just waiting for someone to gank, and the hunters wishing they just weren't here. Let's see how the melee camp shapes up against each other in terms of playstyle, enjoyment and where each class is excelling. Single target, AoE or maybe a bit of both. We'll touch on numbers briefly, but anything could happen between now and BFA's release when it comes to numbers. But if someone is great at AoE, chances are they're still going to be great at AoE until something huge changes. Let's kick this party off by looking at the Death Knights, starting with Frost. Frost Death Knights wield the runic powers of ice and sleet to bombard their foes with chilling damage, and they can even summon forth a giant undead dragon to breathe across the battlefield. That's still got to be one of the most awesome abilities in the game, and I'm glad it stuck around as we head into Battle for Azeroth. Frost received a handful of changes from Legion, mainly to how their cooldowns worked, but nothing super game changing or breaking. They still remain quite a fluid spec to play, with a few procs which affect different spells, like getting free Howling Blasts and guaranteed crits on Obliterate. The rune system means that Death Knights will always start with a lot of resources, and as the fight progresses you'll end up waiting more and more for those runes to recharge, especially at the start of an expansion when our haste will be its lowest. Frost Death Knights pack a decent punch when it comes to single target, but their real damage potential comes when you add in a few more stacked enemies. With Howling Blast cleaving, Remorseless Winter chunking away your enemy's health, and a few swings of your Frost Scythe, you deal incredible amounts of burst AoE damage. A lot of your damage is front loaded though. If you don't have any runes, or you're waiting for them to come back off cooldown, your damage won't be as high, so amazing burst AoE potential, but their sustained damage is going to be a little lower. They also start out each new fight with quite a fast pace, burning through your runes as quickly as you can, and then they tend to slow down a bit more from there. You're also going to be a little slow when compared to some other classes when it comes to movement. Death Knights only get a small movement speed cooldown as baseline, and you're pretty much just walking everywhere. No charges, no crazy jumping through the air, just a casual stroll up to your next victim. On the upside, Frost Death Knights are fairly easy to pick up and play, so you can go from not knowing anything at all about Death Knights to kicking out some awesome DPS in no time at all. Now, where Frost is pretty simple and straightforward, Unholy is a bit more complex. You have runes and runic power just like Frost, but you also have to keep an eye on your festering wounds. Unholy gameplay revolves around inflicting these wounds and then blowing them up with various abilities. It's a lot of fun when you get it right, but it takes a little more concentration and quite a bit more planning when compared to some of the other classes in this list. Playing well will reward you with some crazy AoE damage and some pretty strong single target damage too, especially if you talent for it. Playing poorly will reward you with a spot down the bottom of the DPS meters. If you're looking for something easy, stick to Frost. If you can hack the extra effort, or you're even seeking a challenge, Unholy could prove to be right up your alley. You also get to run around with your very own ghoul, who you can sick on your enemies, and he'll even try to gnaw off a few limbs. But that does mean you could run into issues with the pet AI. They like to get stuck in walls and just pull anything they can see, so be wary of that. Unholy also starts off pretty fast paced because you typically start off with a full bar of runes, but as you start using abilities and spreading your nasty diseases, the gameplay slows down considerably. If you get lucky, your rune regeneration can double for a few seconds. Getting a few of those procs in a fight can really speed everything up. Not getting any of those procs can feel incredibly lame, so there's a bit of RNG in there which decides the pace of your gameplay. Because a lot of their damage revolves around festering wounds, you can run into a few issues. You have quite a bit of ramp up time because you have to apply a few wounds before you can start bursting them, and if targets are dying very rapidly, you just won't get a chance to do anything yourself. This also makes it quite frustrating when you have to target swap. You have to start the whole process all over again. But if you can deal with the extra effort, Unholy can set themselves up for success in almost any situation depending on how you spend your talents. Sadly, they'll be lagging behind with the Frost Death Knight to the back of the pack due to their lack of decent mobility though. If you love how edgy Death Knights are, but you aren't too keen on the whole undead thing, how about a Demon Hunter? They're basically demons, but in elf form. if that's your sort of thing. They use all manner of demonic energy to assault their foes, including eye beams and barrages of destruction. They have quite a few really cool looking abilities, and they just have a lot of flavour as a whole. You can double jump and glide with your demonic wings and dash around the battlefield faster than almost anyone else. If you're looking for a fast-paced, highly mobile melee character, Demon Hunters might be the best choice. They do end up being quite spammy to play though. They only have a handful of abilities and probably one of the easiest melee classes to pick up and play, probably even easier than Frost Death Knight. You use Demon's Bite to generate Fury, and Chaos Strike to spend it. That's sort of your bread and butter as a Demon Hunter, so not that much has changed from Legion to Battle for Azeroth. Your other abilities will be weaved into the mix, obviously, Eye Beam, Fell Rush, maybe a Blade Dance or two on AoE fights, but most of the time you'll be spamming Chaos Strike. If that sounds a bit too simple, well, we've got plenty else on offer, but they're doing quite well for themselves on AoE fights, especially if they take the Fell Barrage talent. The amount of damage you can output with that is pretty crazy. After that, their damage will fall off, but they can still hold their own for the most part. On single target, Demon Hunters are struggling just a little bit, but their kit is fairly well designed for single target damage, so that's probably a numbers and tuning problem as opposed to them just being terrible on single target. I guess it doesn't help that the momentum talent is doing pretty well right now, which requires you to dash around like a lunatic to deal extra damage. If you're not too careful, you can end up dashing into something quite dangerous, especially when you get into raid encounters. High mobility is great, but when you're forced to use that mobility to deal extra damage, you can make quite a lot of extra mistakes. Up next is the Rogue specs. Rogues are actually the only class with all melee DPS specs, which is kind of cool. Let's have a look at Outlaw first, because being a pirate has never been more fun. Slashing away with your longsword, getting a few sneaky stabs in with your dagger and firing off a few shots from your concealed pistol. Is there anything more enjoyable? How about rolling some dice to decide your damage output? Literally, Outlaw Rogues are highly dependent on RNG, but if they weren't gambling absolutely everything on the roll of a dice, could we really consider them proper pirates? I doubt it very much. They're playing out more or less the same as they were throughout Legion, except Blade Flurry is now on a charge-based system instead of a toggle. That means you can still destroy everything around you while using Blade Flurry, it just won't be up 100% of the time. But that doesn't stop them dominating the DPS meters on Cleave and AoE. Their potential damage is staggering, but it does rely on Roll the Bones. If you roll your dice and get unlucky again and again and again, that's such a different story than rolling 2 or even 3 decent buffs on your first roll. The damage difference between a lucky and unlucky Outlaw Rogue is shocking, so much so that you could dominate the meters by leaps and bounds, or you could be sat below the tanks. If you're worried about a little risk, the pirate's life probably isn't for you, but I find it wonderfully enjoyable. It's incredibly fast-paced even with the energy restrictions, thanks to procs to reduce the cost of your next pistol shot to help generate a lot of combo points very quickly. Your rotation and priority can also change depending on how your dice rolls go, so you have to be on your toes to switch things up if you get really lucky. Outlaw excels in AoE and cleave situations, especially if they get lucky, but their single target damage isn't all too great right now and suffers even more from bad rolls. They also can't really hit targets that are spread far apart, but they have all the other good stuff that rogues bring to the table, like exceptional defensive utility and fantastic mobility. They're going to be a great pick anywhere they can deal some AoE damage. Assassination Rogues are up next, and they're playing more or less how they always have. Lots of poisons, lots of bleeds, and a whole lot of sympathy for anyone who gets in their way. Where Outlaw will destroy meters in Cleave and AoE situations, Assassination prefers to take their targets one at a time. Their single target damage is pretty good when they can get everything rolling, and if given the time they can ramp up all of their damage over time effects across multiple stacked up enemies, so they will also excel in any council fights where you can stack the bosses up. Applying ruptures and poisons to multiple targets that will survive for quite a while will always be very powerful, but if targets are dying too quickly, then Assassination Rogues won't really get to ramp up at all. This makes short AoE fights a little frustrating because by the time you got some good damage rolling, the targets are probably about to die thanks to that blasted Arms Warrior and his Blade Storm. Your poisons and bleeds will always be better when your victims stay alive long enough to suffer. Being reliant on damage over time effects means there's going to be some ramp up involved in pretty much anything you do, but once you get things rolling you should do very well in most boss encounters. I think you'll find a lot of Outlaw Rogues in lower Mythic Plus dungeons where their trash will fall over much faster, but Assassination will be able to stretch its legs much easier in the higher level keys, especially with the fortified affix where trash will survive long enough for the poisons and bleeds to add up. Assassination will always do great whenever the damage over time effects are allowed to do their thing. While Outlaw relies heavily on RNG, Assassination relies on focus and planning. It takes quite a lot more effort to play an Assassination Rogue perfectly, With that being said, a lot of what made Assassination interesting or unique has kind of disappeared with the end of Legion. You'll be focusing on maintaining Rupture and Garrote where possible, and then using Envenom. That's pretty much the extent of your gameplay, maybe a little bland compared to Outlaw. Subtlety shares quite a few of Assassination's strengths, but plays out a little differently. Most of Sub's damage is up front instead of damage over time. They're also tooled more towards single target damage as opposed to AoE damage, but they can still kick out some decent numbers if enough targets are present. You can generate combo points so quickly spamming Shuriken Storm, it's pretty insane, but outside of secret technique you can't really use those combo points to deal more AoE damage. That puts Sub into a really strange situation where increased cleave actually increases single target damage because you can get combo points really quickly and spam your eviscerates all day long. They're also the rogue spec which pops in and out of stealth the most with their Shadow Dance ability, which you'll need to master along with Nightblade, Shadow Blades and Symbol of Death. Getting the most out of all their various cooldowns will take quite a lot of practice. I think Sub Rogue is probably the hardest rogue spec to play to its utmost potential, so if you want to stick to something a little easier, the Pirate's Life is always available. Just blow on your dice before you roll them. I think Sub will shine in the same ways Assassination will. Single target damage will be really good, adding in a few targets might be great if they're stacked up and survive for quite a long time, but whereas Assassination will spread their dots around, Sub will channel all of those extra targets into more boss damage. Overall, rogues are going to be a fantastic melee DPS in Battle for Azeroth, whether you're rocking the meters on huge AoE pulls as Outlaw, or destroying the bosses as Assassination or Subtlety. If you were interested in the rogues but would rather run around as a little kitty cat, Feral might be the right choice for you. They play sort of similar to Assassination rogues, except they're all bleeds and no poisons. Most of your damage will revolve around keeping Rake and Rip active on as many targets as possible, which isn't really all that easy when you're restricted by your energy. They suffer from the same problems as Assassination in that they have quite a bit of ramp up time, and if they aren't given any time to get rolling, Feral Druids just don't really do any damage. They also don't have much upfront AoE if you don't talent specifically for it, so large AoE pulls with a group of bursty DPS will probably make you a very sad kitty. They do, however, usually get a chance to get their bleeds going on boss encounters, so even if the other DPS won't let you have much fun on the trash, you should get to have some fun on the bosses, and their single target damage is okay. I wouldn't say Feral Druids come close to something like Assassination Rogues, but they should put up a fight on single target at least. Most of the allure of Feral Druids comes from the options to play any other role in the game. You can play a Feral Druid 1 minute, a Bear Tank the next, and then maybe next week you can swap things up and run around as a Boom Chicken. If choice is something you're looking for, you can't really go wrong with Druids. Personally, I probably wouldn't ever pick up a Feral Druid with so many other options on the table, simply because they play very similar to Assassination Rogues, but I don't think you will ever see the same results. You have to put a lot of effort in to squeeze out some good DPS from a Feral Druid, and usually you're going to get beat by the 1, 2, 3 specs anyway. It just doesn't seem worth it. The good news is that if you enjoyed Feral Druid in Legion, you shouldn't have much to worry about. It's playing out more or less the same. They even removed the GCD on Tiger's Fury. If you enjoy it and want to play it, have at it. And then to round out the leather users, we also have the Windwalker monks, who are doing pretty well for themselves right now. Windwalkers use energy and chi to assault their enemies, channeling fists of fury to pound several enemies into submission, and knocking a few teeth out with their roundhouse blackout kicks. If you ever wanted to pretend you're playing a fighting game, but run dungeons and raids while you're doing it, monks should give you a pretty good experience. They're quite flashy with abilities like Rising Sun Kick and Whirling Dragon Punch, and their mobility rivals that of a Demon Hunter's, especially when they're using theirs to try and deal extra damage. You can clear a crazy amount of distance with 2 rolls and your Flying Serpent Kick. I don't think anyone else can match that. Monks are great in both single target and AoE encounters, but they really get to have fun when more targets are added into the mix. A lot of their kit is just built to deal damage with more targets, like Storm, Earth and Fire. Splitting yourself into 3 elements which all use the same abilities is pretty fantastic. Split into 3, channel some Fists of Fury and follow it up with a Whirling Dragon Punch for some crazy damage and a wonderful display. I love watching my little mini-me's run around and use the same abilities. They have great burst potential on single target with Touch of Death, and AoE when they blow all of their cooldowns. With how they're doing right now, I think Windwalker monks will be a solid pick for any group, both for raiding and for dungeons. They bring an AoE stun to the table and can pull off some crazy stuff with Ring of Peace. That's pretty cool coming from a DPS. They're just a great, well-rounded spec right now. The only problem that they might run into is that they don't have a great defensive ability outside of Karma, which might be an important factor for high-level Mythic Plus keys. Moving on, let's check out the Enhancement Shamans. These chaps are in a bit of a pickle, not because they aren't putting out some good numbers, but because their future is a little unclear. Enhancement Shamans get lumped in with their Elemental Brothers and Shadow Priests, all of which will see some changes in the first major patch of Battle for Azeroth, patch 8.1. Apparently the dev team ran out of time with these specs, so they didn't get the changes that were planned. So if you're unhappy with Enhancement right now, hope may be just over the horizon. But if you enjoy the way the spec feels and plays, we have no idea what changes could come our way. They could tip the spec on its head, so that's a little worrying. But seeing as we don't know what the future holds, how is Enhancement doing right now? I'd say they're doing pretty well. It's a little clunky at times, and boy oh boy does RNG play a big part of your damage with Storm Strike resets, but it's functional and it's doing some pretty decent single target damage right now. If you get lucky, you can destroy the meters. Their AoE is a little more lackluster, but it's not like you don't have anything exciting to push when your tank pulls half the instance. Crash lightning into a few Storm Strikes is pretty satisfying and can yield some decent numbers. You're not going to see Outlaw Rogue or Unholy Deathlight numbers, but that's not what our kit is really designed for anyways. Single target is where you'll make your mark as an Enhancement Shaman, providing of course that you enjoy the playstyle. You might have a few problems if you need to move around a lot though. Enhancement Shamans absolutely have to be hitting something at all times, otherwise their potential just plummets. They also don't have any great defensive abilities, so any high damage encounters or high level Mythic Plus keys might be a bit beyond their capabilities right now. I think the best and worst part of an enhancement comes back to that RNG. Just like an Outlaw Rogue, you can either be way ahead of everyone else or potentially below the tanks, depending on whether or not you get those Storm Strike resets. If you don't, you're looking at a slow, dull playstyle. If you get proc after proc after proc, enhancement can be one of the spammiest specs in the game. The other male wearer we have in the melee camp is the Survival Hunter. Even though they're still only half a melee, if you ask me, their new changes going into Battle for Azeroth kind of solidifies that too. Instead of being locked into melee combat with every single ability, half of your abilities are actually ranged. You can happily fire off a Serpent Sting or two from your hidden crossbow or throw a grenade from afar. Kill command relies on your pet being in melee range, but you can be anywhere you want, and in fact the only ability that really requires you to be in melee range is Raptor Strike, and there's even a cooldown to allow you to use that from 40 yards away. Apart from that, the only damage you'll be missing out while not in melee combat with something is your auto attacks, which will mean still quite a lot of missed damage, but I find it really interesting that Survival seems to be designed as a ranged melee spec. You're going to have to be in melee to do the most damage possible, but if you have to move around and run away, quite a lot of your damage can be sustained, especially if you pop Aspect of the Eagle. I'm really enjoying the new Survival way more than I did in Legion. I think if I were to pick up my Hunter again for this expansion, I wouldn't be surprised if I played Survival more than the other two specs. The little hidden crossbow for Serpent Sting reminds me a lot of Outlaw Rogues with their concealed pistols, and kind of gives me a Demon Hunter from Diablo 3 vibe for some reason, but you'll be utilising your poisons and bombs to deal some decent damage over time, filling in the gaps with Kill Command to generate focus and Raptor Strike to spend focus. There's a few cool talent options which can change up how you play as well, like getting procs for instant higher damage Serpent Stings, allowing your Serpent Sting to cleave to nearby enemies, and even changing the way your bomb works and giving it interactions with your other abilities, like Raptor Strike or Carve applying a bleed to anyone suffering from your Wildfire Bomb. As you might expect, Survival is doing really well on cleave fights where they can deal damage to multiple targets, but their kit works really well in single target situations as well. You might have a bit more trouble keeping up on huge AoE pulls, but you should still be able to kick out some awesome damage, especially if you run with Butchery. Their main weakness comes from a lack of AoE without the Butchery talent, and quite a few old Survival Hunters might feel the spec is a bit too easy or simplified with these new changes. They're also still a Survival Hunter, and have a pretty bad reputation coming from Legion, which might take a little while to get over, but apart from that I think the spec feels pretty good. If you're more interested in channeling the powers of light to smite your foes, look no further than the Retribution Paladins. Judge your foes with mighty hammers, tear them to pieces with grand holy blades, and spend your hard-earned holy power on devastating strikes. They definitely fit the bill if you're looking to be a crusader of the holy light. Their playstyle is pretty fluid coming from Legion, not much has changed besides a few talent swaps. You can even pick up your old artifact ability if you really want to. Judgment and their mastery was simplified, so you can spend your holy power more freely, and Blade of Justice can now reset without having to rely on a talent, which can help fill in the gaps left in your rotation where you're just standing around for a second or two. I've seen a lot of conflicting opinions on Rep Paladins. It seems like they're either a lot of fun to play, or they're just really tedious to play. I can see how you could get bored playing a Rep Paladin. You don't have a great deal of variance in your rotation and playstyle, build Holy Power with Crusader Strike and Blade of Justice, spend it on Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm, and just keep judging as many people as you can. It's not particularly exciting, but it is reliable. You can plan for your next few heavy hits because you know roughly when you're going to get enough holy power to unleash on your desired target. Right now, Retribution seems to be doing pretty well for themselves on single target fights. They can keep up with a lot of different classes and push ahead if they get some lucky resets. They don't really benefit too much as you start adding in extra targets though. A second target doesn't really mean that much. A third target might get you to use Divine Storm instead of Templar's Verdict, but with our spinning hammers removed, we don't actually have a consistent source of AoE damage outside of Consecration. And if the mobs end up moving, well, that's just great, isn't it? I guess I'll lay down another one and hope they don't move this time. As you might expect, this can leave them a little short on DPS in big AoE packs. Divine Storm can pack a pretty big punch, but that's the only source of AoE damage you're going to get. I like the changes that Rep received going into Battle for Azeroth, and I think they'll do fine on single target, but I do worry about the rest. They do bring some pretty unique utility to a group though, like extra mana for a healer and a small shield for the tanks with your greater blessings, and then you have Blessing of Protection and Freedom as well as Divine Shield. With everything, they can handle quite a few nasty tasks. It's about time we started talking about warriors. Let's kick things off with arms because everyone knows you're just here to see some awesome blade storms. Wielding your favourite two-handed weapon, you can happily destroy your foes in almost any situation. You can deal damage to an extra target with sweeping strikes and go full-blown AoE with Whirlwind and Blade Storm. You can also just chip away at one enemy if that's all you have to work with. Arms warriors are doing really well in almost any situation as long as you tweak a few talents here and there. I think you should generally do pretty well in raids and dungeons as an arms warrior. I wouldn't worry too much about numbers and performance. What I would worry about is pulling aggro off the tanks and large AoE pulls with Blade Storm. Arms warriors have a crazy amount of AoE burst damage. That's pretty much the only thing I still struggle with when I'm playing my tank. My arms warrior popping everything he has, shattering everything's armor with Warbreaker and going to town with his Whirlybird. Just give them a second or two before you go crazy, or pop Die by the Sword after Blade Storm ends so you don't immediately fall over. The only problem you might run into as an arms warrior is trying to fill the gaps in your rotation. The only source of rage you have is auto attacks unless you pick up specific talents, so you'll be standing there waiting for an auto attack or two some of the time, which isn't all that thrilling. Arms warrior has sort of slowed down quite a lot since Mists of Pandaria. They're supposed to be slow, heavy hitters with windows of burst damage. Well, you can certainly feel the slow part unless you get some lucky resets on overpower, so there's a little bit of RNG still in Arms Warrior, but not quite as much as during Legion, and it's not going to seriously make or break your damage output. If you can get past the slow playstyle, Arms should deliver great numbers in most situations. Now, even though Arms Warriors can Blade Storm without having to rely on talents, that doesn't mean our bold and brave Fury Warriors can't have any fun whirling around and around. And where Arms Warriors are pretty slow, Fury Warriors are anything but. You're going to be spamming abilities left and right as a Fury Warrior, building up that rage to go on a rampage and slaughter your foes. With a few tweaks here and there, Fury Warrior has become one of the most fluid and fast-paced specs in the game. You'll always have something to press because most of your abilities don't require rage. They actually generate it. So while an Arms Warrior will be waiting on auto attacks starved for rage, Fury Warriors will be piling the damage on with Bloodthirsts and Raging Blows and unleashing their rage with Rampage. It's a lot of fun to play and a lot of fun to watch. Your weapons just swing everywhere constantly. It's great fun, but you don't actually have many exciting variations in your rotation to look forward to. Even though it's pretty fast paced, you're spamming the same abilities over and over again. You can talent for some free execute procs to change things up, and your Raging Blow can reset, but it doesn't really change much in the long run. You also won't get a break while you're fighting. If you stop spamming abilities, your damage is going to plummet. So while Fury is faster, you won't really have any time to breathe like you will with Arms Warriors. That might be something to consider if you don't want to wear out your keyboard or your fingers. Apart from that, it looks like Fury is going to do really well for itself as well. You won't see anywhere near the burst AoE of an Arms Warrior, and getting to that point where you can start dealing some good AoE damage takes a little bit of time, but Fury is solid on single target, cleave and AoE fights. You also won't be quite as reliant on your cooldowns to get some decent damage, while your battlecry windows will still be important. It's not going to absolutely cripple your DPS if something bad happens during those small windows. Warriors are going to be a great melee DPS, which isn't really anything new, but I feel like the changes to both specs are some good improvements upon how they were playing throughout Legion. If you absolutely have to have a laid out ranking just to call me out on everything I got wrong, well, I can do that for you. My ranking would put all three rogue specs in the top tier. I think they're just so good right now and their utility is still pretty broken. Next I would have both warrior specs, Windwalker monks and both death knights. These guys are doing really well right now and should find a spot for themselves in any group. Unholy death knights might end up being hit or miss in your group simply because they take a little more effort to play. Then I would have survival hunters, rep paladins and havoc demon hunters. These specs still do really well for themselves and are probably just a teeny bit below the second tier because they're still doing great, but I don't think they're doing quite as well as the ones above, either because they're a little boring or they're missing something from their kit. It should probably be more like a tier 2.1 rather than a tier 3, but down at the bottom I would put Enhancement Shamans. They're going to be feast or famine no matter what you do or how good you are, and I don't think their kit really makes up for that fact. They also have an uncertain future, which is never good, and Feral Druids just aren't doing that well right now. I think a better reason to play Feral Druid would be their flexibility and multiple options of roles and specs, rather than to play a Feral for its playstyle or contributions to a group. And that's it for this video. What do you think of my ranking for the melee specs? What did I get wrong, or what do you think I got right? Who would you put at the top right now? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. If you want to hop on that train, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.